This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support.
Hybrid Cloud Show, episode 42. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. Shane, am I right you've been playing with Helm charts and had a bit of an issue?
Yeah, I've been having some issues with Helm charts that maybe you folks can help me out with. I basically found some of my applications were no longer running and got on there to investigate and started having real issues with a couple of the apps I run in my home lab at home.
Okay, so what apps are you installing on your home lab with these Helm charts?
Quite a few, actually. Your normal self-hosting apps, Image, Jellyfin, Git-T, Paperless NGX, if anyone's heard of it. I've attempted Nextcloud, a few like that.
What was this paperless thing that you were talking about?
So Paperless is a document scanner. So it's got like an open source Android app. You take photos of your documents like bills or anything else you want to keep. It automatically uploads it to Paperless, and Paperless will do like OCR recognition and analysis on the docs, and you can sort and filter and categorize your documents and try to be paperless.
That's cool. Sorry, that wasn't your question. So, what's your issue with Helm charts?
Things were broken and I was trying to figure out why. Helm charts are super easy to get up and running, but in a way I didn't expect, it does introduce a running dependency that could cause you issues if things break.
Sounds like every other dependency out there. What in particular is breaking that's causing your applications to fail?
I think what differs here is that if something broke, we'll say in the Docker Compose world, a dependency that was external, my application would still keep running just fine. Now, you're turning your head confused and like, why did Shane's running applications break if some dependency changed? The issue I worked out eventually was that one of the cool things about Kubernetes is you can have lots of different nodes running everything, and you can swap out those nodes when, say, for example, your ThinkPad Z13 starts to have a broken keyboard because it's a piece of crap hardware. So you can say, I'm going to retire that for now and wait for it to be repaired. I'll grab a laptop from the home lab and just start using that. That happened at the same time as the Bitnami image deprecation. So I spun up a new node to make up for the lost node. It doesn't have any cached images, and a bunch of remote images now are completely wiped.
I'm trying to follow this. You've got a stack of laptops running your Kubernetes cluster at home.
Yes, I've found a real use for the stack of laptops.
Like all professionals, duh.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have them.
This is an enterprise environment, Aaron, I'll have you know.
So TLDR is you pulled a worker node out of your cluster. The pod tried to spin up on a different worker node, which didn't have the image cached, and the image was no longer available upstream.
That's one of the few issues I've had, yes.
And you don't have any kind of local caching of the Docker images that you're using?
What I learned was that's per node. So for each server, it'll have its own cache of images you pull from that. Again, sort of things you only learn after it blows up in your face, essentially. But this isn't really like Kubernetes bad, Docker Compose great. I'm assuming Docker Compose can't even have this issue, or the way I run it, which is one running instance on one box. I'm not taking things out of the node, we'll say.
Yeah, well, this still would have happened, right, if you had all of the Docker Compose on an NFS mount, pulled out the box, put a new one in, mounted the NFS share, and not had the image there, assuming you weren't using some kind of pull-through cache for the images or something, which clearly you wouldn't be at home. That
was one of the issues I was having, and the reason I complained about Helm is I'm dependent on Helm charts that will need to be maintained by someone who will need to be referencing these new images. And I was blocked by that. And that's just one instance of issues I was having. The other was a chart I depended on. I think this was also Paperless NGX, also depended on another chart called BJWS. It seems like where common functions for running Helm charts live. That was renamed to BJSW Labs. And so, the chart I'm dependent on is now dependent on another chart to resolve itself or to reconcile itself. So my Paperless NGX server's down. I don't have images in the cache. and the chart I've got is now pointing to something that doesn't exist. So you're left with not a lot of control in how you fix this without just basically reproducing everything locally. You're in a bit of a world of pain, essentially.
Shane, are you deploying these Helm charts using Argo?
No, I am using Flux.
Flux, that's what it was. That's right. So, in case you didn't know, Helm charts also have versions. And so if there was a particular version that was working because BJS, that subchart was correctly configured, right? Then that should still continue working unless they also changed out their infrastructure as well to no longer work with that. Was that not possible?
The chart hadn't been updated, though. Are you referring to the BJWS dependency?
Yeah.
So with that chart, the latest version of the chart didn't include the fix because there was no fix yet applied. So I was basically on a version of the chart that pointed to a dependency that didn't exist anymore.
Right. So that BPJS, right, moved all their stuff, but the chart you were using didn't swap that out and you couldn't. Okay, I understand now. So, that's a tough break. Some Helm charts, especially like the bigger ones, they'll let you specify the image that you want to use of any other like subcharts. And sometimes it comes in handy for cases like this. Or if you have like, by default, something comes like a Bitnami image, but you want to use a chain guard image, then like you can do that. You can swap it out really easily. It sounds like this developer didn't really put too much effort into their Helm chart for that. That's unfortunate. Yeah.
I think I've had some unlucky breaks. Again, I'm still like happy with the whole thing in general, but I found that you're very much reasoning with the whole system when you're working with Kubernetes. And that can be kind of time consuming when you don't have a lot of free time.
Presumably you're only running one copy of these containers in the Kubernetes cluster.
It'll run depending on the rules I've got configured and the amount of nodes I've got set up, essentially. So I have a couple of laptops. So there may be a copy of something running in a couple of different nodes.
I'm just wondering about your paperless disappearing on you. Did you have it running somewhere else, or was it just the single copy of it?
So the whole Helm chart busted and they re-reconciled to a broken version, which affected all the nodes. It may have had a couple of pods. I don't know where they were distributed on the nodes, though. But it was all in Kubernetes, and as a result, all broke.
I think we covered this before, but you've basically run Kubernetes at home just for kicks, right?
Yeah, I saw what Sean was doing and said, that's cool. So I want that pain. And so here we are. I'm just in the same place, but no far less. It's great.
I did try and warn you.
Yeah, this could be titled When I Should Have Listened to Gary Again. I'm still not regretful of the whole thing, though. It's pretty good. It's still quite cool. The novelty of it hasn't worn off. It was just, I've had to right now, to be honest, disable Nextcloud. I've had to disable paperless NGX for now because I didn't have the time to fix these issues. I did fix Git-T, which is also broken and dependent on a Bitnami Postgres, by replacing it with a CNCF managed Postgres instance and moving that along. But I lost my data, so some pain's going on here.
Didn't we cover Bitnami images being deprecated like a while ago?
Yeah. Look, this is not... It's real true enterprise, Sean, where nothing gets updated until you're hacked and everything blows up.
It's a little off topic for the show, but can you tell me a bit more about paperless NGX? Just because I've had on my long list for a very long time that I would like to get Nextcloud running or something for a very large number of scanned documents from the last many years. Is that what this thing does, aside from the scanning thing?
Yeah, essentially it's opinionated file storage for documents where you want to scan and tag and retrieve them. So it's got an app. The app itself has like a little scanner built into it using your phone, obviously. You can also, I think it does email processing, so it'll import documents from emails if you want to do that. And effectively, it'll build up this long-running library of documents that can be tagged and filtered however you want. And I think it's got some machine learning in there if you want to do automated tagging or add correspondence, I think is a term to the documents, to give access to people if you wanted to be multi-user.
And better for you than Nextcloud for that kind of purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's opinionated for precisely scanning bills, scanning legal documents, and being able to retrieve them rather than Nextcloud being kind of a bit more generic and not being opinionated enough for this use case.
Nextcloud on Kubernetes is just a right pain. Let me tell you, I don't recommend it.
What do you mean on Kubernetes? It just is.
All right, fair enough. No, actually, no. I take it back. On Kubernetes in particular, because Nextcloud is moving their developer model to make these things called external apps. And so instead of developing an application extension via PHP, you can now develop it in whatever language you want. And then you format your app as a container, as a Docker container image, as an OCI container image. And then what you do is when you install the app, Nextcloud will then spawn that container image and then know how to connect to it and then be able to use it, which is, I think, a good idea, making it a really extensible system to be able to just leverage any extension for Nextcloud. That makes sense. However, if you're doing this on Docker, then it has a Docker socket. It can just spawn that. It's no problem. But on Kubernetes in particular, there is no Docker socket. And so there's no way to get a container runtime for Nextcloud to be able to spin up these external apps. And it's just been broken. And I've asked in like the GitHub, when is this going to happen in the Helm chart? And there's been no response. So I find it odd that there's this whole entire thing for external apps that's been pushed, but then no solution for Kubernetes.
Man, never did I think I would hear anyone refer to giving a publicly exposed PHP application access to the Docker socket as a good idea. That sounds mad.
Enterprise.
Oh yeah, it's 100% enterprise. I'd definitely be comfortable with putting that in production.
That's a good point. I had not thought of that. Running arbitrary containers wherever you like is fine for websites. That's great.
Sean, I saw that you have been at Texas Linux Fest giving successful talks. Is that right?
I don't know if I would consider a room packed full of engineers successful, but I was pretty happy with it. I couldn't believe it. I was giving a talk this year, my first time talking at Texas Linux Fest, about creating your own bootable container. So it was actually a workshop more than a presentation. And the room was packed. So it sounds like people are very much excited to go cloud native on all these technologies.
Is it big hats and boots and things at Texas Linux Fest?
If you've been to Texas, you know that everything is large. Let me tell you.
So what were you talking about in the boot containers talk?
So we covered how a bootable container image is just a normal container image using a normal container file. And then I made an example where we put two different services into one container. And that was cool. Then we got to run it locally as a container, no problem. But then the trick was to now take this bootable container image and then make it into a disk image that you could deploy on a VM. I got a lot of questions about some intricacies and how does, if I change something on the host, how does that work when the new image comes in? So a bunch of those kinds of insightful questions. And people were very excited about day one versus day two operations. Really shows that people are actually thinking critically about how can this be applied. So I'm hopeful, and I'm going to try to take this on the road and maybe do it at a much larger audience next time.
So what were some of the most common questions that you got around that day two operation? Because I think we've talked before about the bootable containers piece and how it's just a container image and the building of it is relatively straightforward if you're proficient with building containers. So I'm curious as to what some of those common questions or pitfalls that people found in day-to-day operation might be.
Hybrid Cloud Show episode 30, we covered this exact topic and it was insightful. And I actually linked people in a QR code to this talk because I knew they were going to have this question. Things like, if I make a Kubernetes cluster and I want to, add the secrets necessary to link this new node to my cluster, do I do that as part of my image? Or do I use a separate tool to do that? Or do I use Cloud.init and Ignition and Kickstart scripts? What level do you do this at? So we have talked about this previously, but my consensus was it really depends on what you need. And one thing I strongly cautioned against was putting secrets inside of your container image, because usually these are on public registries, where if anybody pulls this image, they now have access to those secrets. There's not really a access control list. It's kind of like a permit all or permit none. So that was my advice.
So are you using bootable containers in your homelab now?
I am. I have several hosts. I have one Kubernetes cluster that runs on bootc. some CentOS images. And then I have a couple of random hosts that do various jobs like Pi-hole or Nginx. And those are on Fedora images. And then my workstations run Bluefin, and my gaming computer runs Baozite, which are all bootable containers. And I've heard that there might be something coming from the ChainGuard department. They have a rolling distro called Wolfie. And I got to talk to a senior vice president of ChainGuard at the conference. He came and gave a talk. And one of the things that he was very excited about was this kind of concept of rolling distros, but for enterprise Linux. How do you guys feel about rolling distros in enterprise?
I think rolling distros generally are an interesting concept. The challenge is always what's rolling and how does it stay in sync, right? So, the traditional model for a distribution was always a snapshot of the world's open source at any point. And then there's a lot of work put in to make sure that set of open source is consistent. So if your model is that you're, getting a distro together that is consistent, then it's very hard to do that together with the idea of rolling. When you see some of these more container-based solutions doing a rolling distro, it's a little bit easier because people are effectively doing their own snapshotting of the open source in the pieces that are relevant to them, and then taking a snapshot at a different level and then putting together those components, whether those components are OCI containers or whether those are, snaps in the kind of Ubuntu core world, where you can do those sorts of things because what's moving is itself internally consistent. But if you're trying to get all of the world's open source moving all of the time and anyone can just update any of those pieces, then getting those things consistent is a very difficult problem.
Exactly right, Aaron. His mantra was, well, if I can figure out the diff between yesterday and today, that's way easier than between 5 years ago and today. Because in these very old school monolithic, CentOS 6 to CentOS 7 kind of jumps, they're very big. I do think you actually have a point about containerization formats for applications being very popular. And I hope that continues to be the trend. In my bootc workshop, we talked about doing quadlets as part of our application instead of trying to install it as a package using DNF. And I absolutely think that's the right way to go. So we'll see if enterprises start to adopt it. One of the things that I really stressed was atomic distros and things like bootc are about controlling when you deploy changes versus limiting them. And I think I heard the ChainGuard CEO say that, and it really resonated with me. And it seemed to resonate with the people in my audience as well.
I think that's a reasonable way of looking at things. The challenge is nearly all the customers I talk to always want the latest, and then they never want to change it for, 5-10 years or something. So there's this internal tension between what people think they want and then what they want once they've deployed it. And so keeping those two things working is quite a difficult balance. And I think that's where some of the containerization stuff gets really powerful, because you can leave your hardware just running as a piece of infrastructure that you never touch effectively. But the things you care about are the applications on top or whatever, and they can move on a different life cycle than in the traditional world where all of that was sort of one monolithic stack.
I think it's a big cultural change, right? Because we have gotten so used to the base OS being this fixed in time thing where dependencies and stuff like that are all just thought about for us by the distro maintainer. Whereas in this new world, like, that is something that we get to choose what that snapshot is, when it gets updated, what changes, when we're ready to move to newer versions of certain packages. And I think that's going to take some time, in the same way that the entire revolution around packaging software as containers and kind of that deployable unit changing from a deb to a container changed. Thinking about your base OS in terms of that is a deployable unit that can also roll and change when you want it to, is quite a shift as well in a lot of people's minds.
I do see the sales pitch, though, of if there is a distro that's reliable enough, I'm now abstracting away the operating system problem. If it's reliable and stays up to date and runs what I need it to run, which is going to be containers, I could see it being a compelling argument, but it is building that trust of like, we are rock solid. We will not break. We're prioritizing reliability. So however you do that is the challenge.
Well, I think that's where the case for an enterprise rolling distro comes in, right? Where those checks and balances in terms of what rolls from one release of a bootable container to the next is tightly controlled by someone that you can trust. And the people that you can trust are those enterprise distro vendors. So I think if there was a CentOS rolling release that you knew you could trust and you could control at what cadence you moved from one snapshot of that to another, that would go a long way versus this is my Fedora that I build with the daily packages myself into a bootable container once a week.
Yeah, in a way, it's quite like Lambda, like more controlled Lambda, in that you don't really care about the compute environment. The bits you care about are your application, its version number. And beyond that, it's sort of irrelevant. I feel like rolling release distros that run containers specifically could turn into like very application-focused operating systems and provide that just application-focused interface rather than running an operating system.
And for me, that's sort of how I treat the boxes that are running the applications that I'm running that are containerized anyway. I don't actually think about what I'm doing. I just have a cron job that goes and redeploys the state to them once a week. It just runs the Ansible. That does an apt update, apt upgrade as part of that. I don't actually really pay attention to what is on the box other than these are the packages I need. Those are generally stuff I use to orchestrate containers or monitor. And these are the things that I need mounted in terms of, NFS mounts or storage or, a volume mounted in a certain location or whatever. There's not anything more I care about on that. And indeed, I think we said before, like about how I orchestrate this stuff is that every LTS release, I blow that machine away, I run the same Ansible on it, and I just Docker compose up the applications again. So for me, having a reliable, consistent rolling model actually achieves exactly the same thing that I'm doing now. It's just that I'm only getting new versions of stuff every 2 years, but I don't actually care what the versions of stuff are. I don't care if I get a new version of HTOP. Who cares?
Yeah, and I think the whole abstraction of all these different layers has made a huge difference for me there. I used to always be on the bleeding edge of Ubuntu releases and things to get the latest stuff. Now, my server runs a version of Ubuntu that's probably a couple of LTSs old, and unless I need something new at the storage layer or the sort of ZFS and LXD host layer or whatever, I don't really care about that so much because I'm sticking VMs on top that can be anything, and on top of those I've got Docker containers or whatever that are running whatever's in those things, and I don't need to worry so much about the bottom layer, which I just want to be stable and keep going.
Yeah, like as I move down the stack with this stuff, I care less about it as long as it's still getting security fixes. My Proxmox hosts are still a version behind. I don't care. The version of Ubuntu on the VMs running the containers is still 2204, and it's still getting security updates. So as long as the Docker engine doesn't have some breaking change that stops me from pulling images, and that LTS of Ubuntu is continuing to get security updates, then that's all fine by me, because the applications and the things that I care about that I'm accessing are all the latest version.
That's probably a good place to wrap things up. Before we do, just a quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you'd like to send us any questions or feedback, you can do that at show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.